Every war declared, every alliance signed, every pact destroyed. The decisions that shaped the kingdom were made by alphas, but the alphas were never alone when they made them. Before each move, before each order, before each act of power, they came to her, not as Luna, not as queen, as something far more dangerous than either. And for years, no one knew. The balance held, the kingdom breathed. Until the day an alpha walked in that she couldn't read, couldn't guide, and couldn't control. She had built something no throne could give her, invisible authority, woven so carefully into the fabric of every pack that removing her would mean watching the entire kingdom collapse. She knew the fears of every alpha, the pride, the blind spots. And she used all of it, not out of cruelty, but because she understood something they never could. Power without wisdom destroys everything it touches. For years, she was the reason the wars ended before they started, the reason the right alliances survived, the reason the kingdom held its breath and kept breathing. And nobody, not a single alpha, not a single Luna, not a single wolf in that kingdom, ever said her name out loud when it mattered most. If any part of you already feels what she carried, drop it in the comments, because what comes next changes everything you think you know about who truly holds power in a kingdom built on strength. Her name was Seraphine. Not a title, not a rank, just a name that moved through the corridors of power like smoke through stone, invisible until it was already inside everything. She was born in the border territories between two mid-ranking packs, in a region nobody fought over because nobody considered it worth the effort. Her father was a low-ranking enforcer who died before she turned 7. Her mother was a healer who understood, long before Seraphine did, that survival in a world built on dominance had nothing to do with strength. It had everything to do with knowing what the strong wanted before they knew it themselves. Seraphine grew up watching. That was the first thing anyone who truly knew her would say about her childhood. Not that she was quiet, though she was. Not that she was isolated, though she often chose to be. But that she watched. She watched the way the pack's beta shifted his weight when the alpha spoke, and how that shift meant disagreement dressed as compliance. She watched the way alliances formed during communal meals, not informal meetings. She watched which wolves left gatherings early and which ones stayed to see who left with whom. She was 8 years old and already reading a political map that nobody else in that border territory even knew existed. Her mother called it a gift. The alpha's mate called it unsettling. The other children simply didn't understand it, and so they kept their distance the way animals instinctively distance themselves from something they cannot categorize. Seraphine did not mind. Distance was useful. Distance meant she could see the full shape of a room without being pulled into any single corner of it. By the time she was 12, she had predicted 3 significant events within her small pack. A betrayal by the head enforcer, who had been quietly feeding information to a neighboring pack for 2 seasons before anyone noticed. A failed challenge for alpha rank that the challenger believed was secret. Seraphine had seen it coming in the way he trained harder than necessary, in the way he stopped making eye contact with the current alpha during meals, in the subtle repositioning of his closest allies in the pack's social hierarchy. And a drought that would affect their territory's food supply, not because she had any supernatural foresight, but because she'd been paying attention to migration patterns of the deer herds, to the way the river level dropped each afternoon, to conversations between older wolves about cycles they had witnessed before. None of these things were magic. All of them were observation turned into strategy. She did not announce her predictions. She simply mentioned them carefully to her mother, and her mother began, quietly, without drawing attention, to mention them to the right people at the right moments. The betrayal was discovered before it caused serious damage. The failed challenge was redirected into a sanctioned sparring arrangement that preserved the challenger's dignity and prevented the kind of fractured loyalty that follows, a public humiliation. The drought was anticipated enough to allow for trade negotiations that kept the pack fed through the worst of the dry season. Nobody knew Seraphine's name in connection with any of it. That was exactly how her mother had taught her it needed to be. In a world where alphas ruled by dominance and challenges were settled through physical combat, a young female with no rank, no bloodline distinction, and no fighting reputation had exactly one path to safety and influence. Indispensability without visibility. Be necessary. Be invisible. Never let the powerful feel threatened by you. Make them feel instead that their own instincts are simply better than everyone else's, and make sure those instincts are quietly yours. It was a lesson that would shape the next 2 decades of her life. When Seraphine was 16, a mid-sized pack to the north, the Stonecrest pack, led by an alpha named Dravek, was on the edge of a war that would have destabilized 3 border territories and triggered a cascade of reactive conflicts across the wider region. The cause was a perceived insult over a contested hunting ground. The reality, as Seraphine read it when she accompanied her mother to a healers' gathering near Stonecrest territory, was far more complex. Dravek was not angry about the hunting ground. He was angry because his authority within his own pack was fracturing, and a visible external enemy was the oldest and most reliable tool for unifying internal dissent behind a leader's back. She spent 3 days at that gathering. She spoke to almost no one of consequence directly, but she observed everything. She noted which of Dravek's betas seemed genuinely loyal and which were positioning themselves for what they believed was an inevitable leadership transition. She noted the way Dravek's mate looked at him during meals, not with the steady warmth of a secure partnership, but with a specific kind of watchful tension that Seraphine had learned to recognize as the expression of someone waiting for a collapse they have already emotionally prepared for. She noted the scouts who arrived with reports and the way Dravek received them, loudly, performatively, for an audience rather than for information. On the 3rd day, through her mother, she arranged to be introduced to the healer who served Stonecrest's inner circle. Nothing formal. A chance meeting over medicinal herb preparations. A conversation about pack health that drifted, naturally, into a conversation about the stress responses she had observed in the warriors she had treated. Seraphine listened, asked careful questions, offered nothing that could be called advice, but made 3 observations framed as questions that the healer, by the end of the conversation, believed she had arrived at herself. The war never happened. Dravek found a different solution to his internal fracture, a solution that, as far as anyone knew, came from his own counsel and the wisdom of his healer. Seraphine returned to her border territory with her mother and said nothing about any of it. But the healer remembered the young woman from the border territories who asked such interesting questions, and the healer spoke to others. Seraphine was 19 when the first alpha sought her out directly. His name was Kalen, and he led the Iron Fang pack, one of the 3 most powerful packs in the region. He was 32, calculating, and politically sophisticated enough to have survived 4 assassination attempts and 2 coordinated challenges to his leadership in 8 years. He was not the kind of man who sought outside counsel easily. He was exactly the kind of man who, when he finally did seek it, had already exhausted every other option and was choosing this one with the cold precision of someone making a last strategic calculation. He came to her without ceremony, no entourage, no formal request, no acknowledgement of what the visit meant. He simply appeared at the edge of the border territory one morning alone and asked if she had time to walk. They walked for 4 hours. He talked, she listened, not passively. She listened the way a surgeon observes a body, searching for the specific point where the problem lives beneath the surface presentation. He told her about a political situation involving 3 allied packs, a disputed succession, and a marriage arrangement that was fracturing under the weight of 2 families' competing ambitions. He framed it as a tactical problem, a matter of resource allocation and strategic alliance. She heard something completely different. She heard a man who was terrified that the alliance structure he had spent a decade building was about to dissolve, not because of the political dispute on the surface, but because of a single relationship at its center. A relationship between Kalen himself and the alpha of the 2nd most powerful pack in the region, a wolf named Osric, whose trust Kalen had inadvertently damaged 2 years earlier through a decision that had seemed at the time entirely unrelated to the current crisis. She did not tell him this directly. Instead, she asked him 4 questions, simple questions apparently. The kind a person asks when they are still trying to understand the situation, but each question was a key turned in a specific lock, and by the time the fourth question was answered, Kalen had arrived at the hidden truth himself. He stood very still for a long moment at the edge of a ridge overlooking the valley below, and the silence that came over him was the specific silence of a man who has just seen something he cannot unsee. He looked at her. She held his gaze and said nothing. "How did you know?" he asked finally. "You told me," she said. "I just listened to the parts you weren't saying." He never forgot that. More importantly, he never forgot what happened next. He went back to Osric. He addressed the damaged trust directly, quietly, without political framing or strategic positioning, exactly as Seraphine had through her questions, led him to understand was necessary. The alliance held. The marriage arrangement found a resolution that satisfied both families. The crisis dissolved without a single act of open conflict, and Kalen returned to Seraphine 3 months later with a different problem, and then again 6 months after that. And then he began to send others to her, carefully, discreetly, framed always as something other than what it was: a healer recommendation, a trade contact, a border territory acquaintance worth speaking to, never her name in formal settings, never her role acknowledged in any council or record. But her influence began to move. It moved the way underground water moves, invisible at the surface, shaping the landscape above in ways that appear natural until you understand the hidden current beneath. By the time Seraphine was 24, she had counseled, directly or through carefully constructed intermediaries, 7 of the 15 most powerful alphas in the region. She had prevented 2 wars, redirected 3 succession crises, dismantled 1 conspiracy before it reached execution, and quietly restructured the terms of a trade agreement that had been creating dangerous economic pressure on 4 smaller packs who lacked the political leverage to renegotiate it themselves. She did all of this from a modest home in the border territory. She held no rank. She sat on no council. She was not an alpha's mate. She was not a lunar. She had at various points been offered positions of formal influence by 3 different alphas who had come to understand her value, and she had declined each offer with a calm that they found simultaneously reassuring and faintly bewildering. She declined because she understood something that none of them fully did. Formal power is visible power, and visible power is vulnerable power. A lunar can be challenged, replaced, undermined through the formal structures that define her role. A council member can be outvoted, excluded, stripped of position, but an advisor who holds no official rank cannot be politically removed from a role that does not officially exist. Her influence had no target, and that was the point. What she had built over those years of careful listening and strategic guidance was something far more sophisticated than personal influence. It was a system, an invisible architecture of relationships, obligations, carefully managed rivalries, and delicately balanced interests that kept the entire regional pack structure stable, without requiring any single act of visible authority to maintain it. She knew that the Iron Ridge pack and the Greymore pack needed to remain in a state of controlled competition, close enough to mutual threat that neither would move aggressively without consulting their respective allies, but never close enough to actual conflict that the wider alliance structure would be forced to choose sides. She managed that tension the way a musician manages the space between notes, adjusting constantly, invisibly, through small interventions that produced large effects. She knew that the aging alpha of the Westcroft pack, a wolf named Brannock, was holding his territory together through sheer personal authority that would not survive his physical decline, and she had spent 3 years quietly building the political conditions necessary for a smooth succession that would preserve Westcroft's stability and prevent the territorial vacuum that would otherwise trigger a feeding frenzy from its neighbors. She knew which alliances were load-bearing and which were ornamental. She knew which rivalries were productive and which were erosive. She knew, with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years mapping a landscape in absolute darkness, exactly how much pressure each part of the system could bear before it fractured. The system worked because it was built on one foundational principle. She could see what was coming, not through magic, not through any gift that transcended the human, or in her world, the wolf, but through an accumulated architecture of knowledge so dense and so carefully organized that she could run forward projections on political situations with an accuracy that, to those who witnessed its results without understanding its mechanism, felt supernatural. She read people the way others read terrain. She understood power dynamics the way a structural engineer understands load distribution. She had spent her entire adult life studying the specific grammar of dominance hierarchies, the syntax of alliance politics, the hidden emotional logic beneath every decision that powerful wolves believed they were making on purely rational grounds. And for years, for beautiful, complex, exhausting years, it worked. The kingdom breathed. The wars that should have happened didn't. The successions that should have been catastrophic were navigated. Othiso, alliances that should have collapsed under the weight of accumulated grievance were quietly, invisibly repaired. Seraphine sat at the center of a web so intricate that even she, on some nights, lay awake, tracing its threads in the darkness, and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite fear, but some precise mixture of both. She had built something extraordinary. She had built a kind of peace, an imperfect, managed, endlessly negotiated peace, but peace nonetheless. And she had built it entirely alone in secret, from a border territory that nobody considered worth the effort. She was 38 years old when she first heard the name Kyle. She heard it the way she heard most significant things, not announced, not formal, but as a current beneath normal conversation. A scout's report to Kalen relayed second-hand through the complex information network she had spent years cultivating. A reference in a message from one of the Eastern Pack leaders she corresponded with, through a series of intermediaries. A name that appeared twice in the same week from completely different sources, which was the first signal she had learned, over 20 years of practice, to treat as significant. Kyle, new alpha of the Ashvale Pack, young, 26, which was young for a stable alpha tenure in a region where most alpha transitions happened through established succession protocols rather than direct challenge. He had taken the Ashvale leadership through challenge, defeating the previous alpha in a confrontation that all accounts described as unusually brutal, not in terms of physical violence, which was a standard part of challenge culture, but in terms of the political precision with which Kyle had dismantled the previous alpha's alliances before the challenge even took place. He had spent 8 months before the formal challenge quietly engineering the isolation of the man he intended to replace, cutting relationships, creating doubts, repositioning key figures within the pack's internal hierarchy so that when the challenge came, it came into a political vacuum that made the outcome inevitable before the first blow was struck. Seraphine read this account 3 times. It was the methodology that held her attention, not the outcome. Alpha challenges and territorial transitions were common enough that they barely registered as anomalies in the regional political landscape. But the method, the patience of it, the structural sophistication, the understanding that a challenge won on political grounds before it becomes physical is a challenge won without meaningful resistance. She had spent 20 years teaching variations of this principle to the alphas she counseled. She had never encountered another wolf who seemed to have arrived at it independently. She filed the information. She did not react. She did not redirect any significant political resources toward the Ashvale situation. She had long ago learned that over-attention to a new variable before you understand its behavior is the fastest way to introduce error into a stable system. She would watch, she would gather, she would let Kale's patterns reveal themselves before she made any significant assessment. That restraint lasted exactly 47 days. In that time, Kyle broke a 3-year trade agreement with the North Fen Pack without warning or negotiation. Not renegotiated, broken. A clean severance, delivered through a single messenger with no explanation offered. And no diplomatic cushioning. The North Fen Alpha, a calculating and generally patient wolf named Seren, was reportedly furious. Seraphine was not surprised by the fury. She was surprised by the manner of the break. In her experience, alpha leaders who broke agreements did so through escalating pressure, through manufactured grievances, through a gradual shift in terms that allowed both sides to construct a mutually face-saving narrative of mutual dissatisfaction. Clean breaks were almost never the rational choice because they created unnecessary enemies at full emotional temperature, with no exit narrative to soften the anger. Unless the anger was the point. 47 days. 2 more significant incidents. Kyle sent an envoy to the Greymoor Pack, one of the packs Seraphine kept in a state of carefully managed competitive tension with Ironridge, and the envoy's message, while formally diplomatic in its language, contained 3 specific references to border demarcations that were deeply provocatively contested between Greymoor and Ironridge. The effect was immediate and predictable. The controlled tension between those 2 packs spiked dangerously. Seraphine spent 6 days in rapid communication with her network, making quiet adjustments, softening the immediate reaction through 4 separate intermediary conversations. She stabilized it, but it cost her, not in resources, in credibility. She had promised certain parties stability, and the stability had briefly, visibly, wobbled. That wobble was small, but small wobbles were how large collapses began. Then Kale did something she could not immediately explain. He offered a significant military alliance to the Westcroft Pack, the pack whose succession crisis she had been carefully managing for 3 years. The offer was generous, too generous, the kind of generous that is never actually generous, that is instead a pressure disguised as a gift, because accepting it would bind Westcroft's future leadership. Decisions to Ashvale's strategic interests in ways that would compromise the careful independence Seraphine had spent years constructing for Westcroft's post-Brannock transition. But old Brannock was ill, and his potential successors were scared, and a generous military alliance from a young, apparently powerful, apparently rising alpha felt to wolves who were looking at an uncertain future, like security. Seraphine sat with this information for a long night. The pattern, when she laid it out, was not chaos. That was the revelation that moved through her like cold water. From the outside, Kale looked like a disruptor, impulsive, aggressive, indifferent to established diplomatic convention, but when she mapped his 3 actions against the existing political architecture of the region, they were not random. Each action had landed precisely on a load-bearing point of the system she had built. The trade break with Northfen created instability in the Eastern Alliance cluster. The envoy, too, Greymoor destabilized the Greymoor-Ironridge tension management. The alliance offer to Westcroft threatened the succession stability she had been building for years. 3 strikes, 3 different structural vulnerabilities, each one isolated would be manageable. Together they created compound pressure on the system's ability to self-regulate. He knew about the system. That was the only explanation that was coherent. He knew about the invisible architecture. He might not know all of it, probably didn't, but he knew enough to understand that there was a pattern of managed stability in the regional political landscape, that the pattern was artificial, and that its artificial nature meant it had specific points of fragility. The question was how? And the question beneath that question, the one that kept her awake as the night moved toward morning, was, what did he actually want? She sent 3 messages through her network the following morning. Each message went to a different person, and each message asked for the same thing. Everything they could find about Kale's background, his movements before the Ashvale challenge, his known associations, his philosophical positions, if he had any that had been expressed outside of formal diplomatic contexts. She framed each request differently, to 3 different people, because she had learned long ago that the shape of the information you receive is determined by the shape of the question you ask, and she wanted 3 different angles on the same subject. The responses took 9 days to accumulate. She spent those 9 days managing the ongoing stabilization work that Kyle's 3 actions had made necessary, while simultaneously maintaining the appearance that nothing unusual was occurring. This was the part of her work that nobody saw and nobody could fully appreciate, the constant, exhausting dual performance of visible calm and invisible urgency. She was managing a slowly destabilizing system while giving every external indication that the system remained perfectly stable, because any visible sign of stress in the management layer would itself become a source of further instability. The alphas who depended on her counsel depended, above all, on the belief that she was ahead of events rather than responding to them. She was, for the first time in years, not entirely ahead of events. She was running alongside them, and the gap between her and what was coming was narrower than it had ever been. The information that came back about Kale was partly what she expected, and partly something she had not prepared for. What she expected, he was exceptional. The challenge victory was not luck. He had been planning it for years, and the political groundwork he had laid was, by the account of the few people who had been close enough to Ashvale's internal dynamics to understand it, genuinely sophisticated. He was intellectually formidable in ways that most alpha leaders were not, because most alpha leaders defined intelligence through tactical acuity, fast reading of immediate situations, rapid calculation of force vectors, quick identification of threat. Kyle apparently thought in longer arcs, structural arcs, what she had not prepared for. One of her three sources, an information broker who moved through the Eastern Territories with remarkable freedom and whose reliability she had tested many times over 15 years, included a single detail that landed in her chest like a stone, dropped into still water. Kyle had been asking about her, not by name. Nobody in his network apparently had her name. But he had been asking, through his own information channels, about the pattern of managed stability in the regional political landscape, about who was behind it, about whether the stability was the product of one intelligence or many, about whether the pattern had a center. He was looking for her. He didn't know who she was yet, but he was looking for the architecture, which meant he would eventually find the architect. And she realized in the specific quality of silence that followed this realization that she had two choices. She could disappear into deeper shadow, sever connections, obscure her network, make herself unfindable, or she could find a way to meet him before he found her, on ground she chose, in conditions she controlled, before he had enough information to understand the full shape of what he was dealing with. Disappearing was the safer option. It was also, she calculated, the less effective one. If Kale was actively looking for the system's center, he would keep looking. And a system whose architect had gone entirely dark was a system that began to lose its coherence from the inside. She could not disappear and maintain what she had built. The system required her ongoing attention, her constant adjustment, her presence at the center of the web. She chose the second option. She would find a way to meet him. She spent 4 days engineering the meeting. It could not be direct. A direct approach would reveal too much about her network's capabilities. It needed to appear accidental, which required constructing an accidental encounter so carefully that the construction itself was invisible. She identified a summit between 3 pack leaders that Kale had recently been invited to attend, a summit she had helped organize 2 years earlier for unrelated reasons, but whose guest list gave her a pretext to be in the same location. She had been considering attending it in an official capacity as a neutral advisor to one of the participating packs. She had been hesitating because visible presence always carried risk. Now, visible presence was the strategy. She arrived at the summit location 1 day before Kale. The summit was held in a neutral ground manner at the edge of 3 pack territories, a location specifically chosen years earlier under her guidance for its symbolic neutrality and its practical utility as a gathering, space that gave no single pack a home ground advantage. She knew every room. She knew the acoustics of the main hall, the way sound traveled through the stone corridors, the specific sight lines from the eastern gallery that allowed observation of the main entrance without being visible from it. She had spent enough time in this building that she could move through it in the dark. She was in the eastern gallery when Kyle arrived the following afternoon. She had been told he was young, 26. She had formed, from the accumulated intelligence of her network and the specific nature of his political moves, an expectation. She had expected someone who wore his intelligence the way young, powerful wolves often wore it, visibly, forcefully, as an extension of physical dominance. A certain kind of bright, calculating sharpness that announced itself because it had not yet learned the advantage of concealment. What she saw from the eastern gallery was something else entirely. He was tall, yes. The physical presence of an alpha, that was simply the biology, unremarkable. What was remarkable was the way he moved through the entrance hall. He paused just inside the doorway in a way that could easily read as simple orientation, but that she recognized with a jolt that surprised her in its intensity as something very specific. He was reading the room, not scanning for threats. Any trained fighter did that, and it looked different, more reactive, more muscular. He was reading the room, the way she read rooms, the way she had read rooms since she was 8 years old, taking the political temperature of every cluster of bodies, every sightline, every territorial implication of who was standing where relative to whom. She watched him do this in approximately 4 seconds, and then he moved into the room with the easy physical confidence of someone who had completed an assessment and filed it for use. He looked up at the eastern gallery, not suspiciously, not searching, just up. The way someone looks up when their peripheral awareness registers a presence. His gaze found her window. She was far enough back from the opening that from below, in the afternoon light, she would register as shadow at most. But she felt, in the way that she sometimes felt things before the evidence caught up with the sensation, that he had not seen a shadow. He had noted a presence. He had noted that the presence did not move or reveal itself, and he had filed that too. She went to her room and sat with her hands folded in her lap for a long time. The first direct conversation between them happened on the second evening of the summit in the outer courtyard, approximately 2 minutes after she had calculated it would happen, and for the exact reason she had arranged. She had engineered a situation in which the most natural and socially unremarkable conversational grouping in the courtyard would bring them into proximity through the movement of others rather than the initiative of either. It was the kind of arrangement that required understanding at least a dozen social dynamics simultaneously and nudging 4 separate conversations over the course of an afternoon dinner to produce the desired geography in the courtyard as the guests filtered outside for the evening. He appeared at her right, separated by the width of a low stone wall, within 90 seconds of the moment she had predicted. "You've been here before," he said. Not a question, not an opening pleasantry, an observation stated as fact, offered into the space between them as if continuing a conversation already in progress. She turned to look at him. Up close, the intelligence was different than she had imagined it even after the gallery observation. Not sharper, she had expected sharp. It was broader. The kind of intelligence that doesn't move in straight lines, but occupies space, like weather. She had met brilliant wolves before. She had counseled some of the most strategically sophisticated alphas in the region. This was different, and the difference registered in her body before her mind completed the analysis. "Several times," she said. "It's a useful location." "For summits," he said. "For many things." A silence, not uncomfortable. The specific quality of silence between 2 people who are each waiting to see whether the other will reveal more than they need to. She had spent 20 years in silences like this. She was very comfortable in them. He was apparently also comfortable. "You arranged the guest list," he said, after the silence had extended long enough to be significant. "For this summit, originally." She held his gaze. "That's an interesting thing to say to someone you've just met." "Is it inaccurate?" Another silence. She made a decision. Not a large decision, a small one, a calibration. She could deflect. She was expert at deflection. But deflection, she had calculated in the 4 days of preparation that had preceded this moment, was the wrong tool for this encounter. If Cale was the kind of intelligence she now believed him to be, deflection would confirm his suspicions while providing him no useful information about the nature of the confirmation. It would be a move he could read without cost to himself. Engagement was the more interesting choice. Engagement was also the more dangerous choice. But danger, in her experience, was simply the price of operating at the most significant level of a situation. And this situation, she understood with a clarity that felt both intellectual and visceral, was the most significant she had encountered in 20 years. "No," she said, "it's not inaccurate." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not going to tell me your name. You're not going to tell me what you want." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile. The shape of it was too complex, too internally directed for a social smile. It was the expression of someone who has just confirmed a theory. "I want the same thing you want," he said. "A stable kingdom. You have a remarkable way of pursuing it," she said. "The previous methods weren't working. They were working for 20 years. They were postponing," he said, and his voice carried something that she recognized with a precision that stopped her breath for a fraction of a second. Conviction. Not the performed conviction of a political speech. Not the aggressive conviction of a dominant wolf establishing position. Real conviction. The kind that comes from having looked at something for a long time and arrived at a conclusion that costs something to hold. There's a difference between a system that creates peace and a system that prevents war. The system you built, and I believe it is remarkable, I want you to understand that I mean that without qualification, the system you built prevents war. It does not create peace. It manages corruption into stability. It keeps structures alive that should have collapsed because their collapse would be inconvenient. And the cost of that management is paid by the wolves at the bottom of those structures every single day in ways that never appear in the political accounting. She was very still, not because he had frightened her. Though there was something in this moment that carried fear as one of its components, she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that. But because he was articulating something that she had thought in the private spaces of her own mind, in the dark hours when the system felt less like a peace and more like a cage she had built for herself as much as for the kingdom. He was saying, with the directness of someone who had nothing to lose by saying it, a thing she had never allowed herself to fully form into language. She needed a moment to choose her next move carefully, not because she didn't know what to say, she always knew what to say, but because what she said in the next 30 seconds would determine the entire shape of what came after. And she was, for perhaps the first time since Kaelin had stood on that ridge 20 years ago, and asked how she had known, operating at the very edge of her own certainty. "You broke the North Fen agreement," she said finally. 300 lower-ranking wolves in the border territories between North Fen and Ashvale depend on that trade agreement for food security. "I know," he said, and the weight of those two words, the flatness of them, the refusal to flinch from the cost, told her more about him than anything else he had said. "And I will rebuild it, on different terms, terms that don't require Saren to maintain 3 illegal labor arrangements in his western settlements to sustain the economic conditions the agreement assumed. The disruption is real, the disruption is temporary, the harm it's been hiding is neither." She looked at him for a long moment. The courtyard around them had the soft noise of a dozen separate conversations, none of which touched this one. "You could have told me first," she said. "I didn't know how to find you," he said, "until recently." The first fracture appeared 11 days after the summit, not in the direct relationship between Seraphine and Kael. That relationship was still in its early charged negotiation, a tension of mutual assessment that had not resolved into either alliance or open conflict. The fracture appeared in the Greymore Iron Ridge tension management, which had been running at elevated pressure since Kael's earlier envoy disruption, and which, in the 11 days since the summit, had received 2 additional pressure inputs that Seraphine was only partially able to trace to their source. A disputed hunting rights claim, seemingly minor, the kind of territorial irritant that appeared in the management system regularly and was absorbed through standard diplomatic adjustment. But this one had a specific character that she recognized, with a sinking feeling that she did not allow to reach her face or her voice in any of the conversations she was managing simultaneously, as manufactured. The evidence trail was too clean, the timing was too precise. The specific language of the claim echoed a border demarcation argument that had been definitively resolved 7 years earlier, and that nobody with a casual understanding of the regional political history would think to resurrect. Someone who was not Kyle, but who had access to detailed historical records of the regional political landscape had constructed this claim, which meant Kale had people working within her system, or adjacent to it, who she had not identified. That night, alone in her study at the border territory home, Seraphine did something she almost never did. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of the situation without immediately converting it into strategy. She sat with it, the fear, the genuine fear, not the managed awareness of risk that she carried always, but the specific fear of someone who has built something enormous and complex and fragile, and can feel for the first time the ground shifting beneath its foundation. She had spent 20 years preventing this. She had spent 20 years making herself indispensable to the stability of a kingdom, so that nobody would be motivated to destabilize the stability itself. She had been so focused on the external threats, wars, successions, rivalries, the endless friction of dominant personalities competing for finite resources, that she had not fully prepared for a threat that came from inside the logic of the system. Kale was not attacking the kingdom, he was attacking her model of the kingdom, and the most destabilizing thing about it was that she could not fully dismiss his argument. The lower-ranking wolves in Saren's western settlements, she knew about the labor arrangements. She had known for 4 years. She had made a calculation at the time that destabilizing Saren's internal arrangements would weaken Northfen's political stability in ways that would have second- and third-order effects on 3 connected alliance structures, and that the harm to the individuals in the settlements, while real, was a contained harm, bad but stable, not escalating, not cascading. She had prioritized systemic stability over individual correction and told herself it was the rational choice, the only choice available given the constraints of her operating position. She had told herself that for 4 years. She was no longer entirely certain she believed it, which was precisely the most dangerous kind of doubt. Not the doubt that paralyzes, she was too experienced and too constitutionally resistant to paralysis for that. But the doubt that introduces a hairline fracture into a load-bearing belief, the kind that doesn't show until the weight increases. The weight was increasing. Over the following weeks, the system, her system, the invisible architecture of 20 years, began to show stress in ways she had never previously managed. Not collapse, not even close to collapse, but a kind of distributed friction, a series of small misalignments that in isolation were entirely manageable and in combination were something she had no direct precedent for. Kalen sent her a message that was careful in its language, but unmistakable in its meaning. Certain members of his inner council were asking questions about the origins of some of his political decisions. Not hostile questions, cautious questions. Questions of wolves who have begun to suspect that their alpha's remarkable strategic instincts might have an external source, and who are uncertain whether to feel reassured or unsettled by that possibility. The invisibility that had been her greatest protection was developing small leaks. Kale's search for the system's center, even though it had now evolved into something more complex than a simple search, had created a disturbance in the water, and that disturbance was causing the people closest to her to look more carefully at things they had previously accepted, without examination. Old Brannock died in the 43rd day after the summit. The succession in Westcroft, that she had been preparing for 3 years, arrived ahead of schedule and in conditions she had not optimized for, because the final months of preparation had been disrupted by the compound pressures Kale's actions had created. The 2 primary succession candidates, Myron, Brannock's niece, and Seraphine's, carefully prepared preferred choice, and Darlin, the pack's head enforcer and a wolf of genuine leadership capability, but dangerously volatile political instincts, moved immediately into open competition. Seraphine had been ready for this succession in a world where the surrounding political landscape was stable. In the current conditions, with Grey Moor and Iron Ridge running hot, with Saren still furious about the Northfen trade severance, with the questions circulating around Kalen's council, managing a contested Westcroft succession simultaneously was the equivalent of replacing a structural support column while the building above it was under additional load. She worked for 6 days without meaningful sleep. 6 days of constant communication, constant adjustment, constant management of the 17 separate relationships that intersected meaningfully with the Westcroft succession. She moved Mirren's position forward by engineering 3 specific conversations between Myron and Keepak, elders. She created enough uncertainty around Dalen's stability to cause 2 of his strongest supporters to quietly reconsider their alignment. She reached through 4 intermediaries, the senior healer within Westcroft, who had the trust of both candidates and whose gentle steering influence could be leveraged to create the conditions for a negotiated resolution rather than an open contest. On the 7th day, she received a message from Kyle. It was delivered through a channel she had not told him about, which meant he had found it himself. The message was brief. It said, "I know you haven't slept. Stop managing the Westcroft succession alone. I have influence with Dalen that you don't. Let me help." She held the message for a long time. The presumption of it, the accuracy of it, the specific way it landed between offer and demand in the narrow territory of a communication from someone who understands you well enough to know which approach you cannot easily refuse. She was furious with herself for how precisely he had calculated it. She was, beneath the fury, something more complicated that she did not immediately name. She sent back a single word. How? His response was immediate, as if he had been waiting, as if he had already written the answer before she sent the question, which meant he had been certain she would say yes. She was going to need to find a way to be less predictable. She was going to need to find, for the first time in her adult life, a way to operate effectively with someone who could at least partially read her. The question that kept her awake that night, not the operational questions, not the management questions, but the deeper one, the one that lived below strategy, was whether Kyle being able to read her was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her, or the most necessary. Comment below. The shadows shift. Because what comes next breaks open something that neither of them is fully prepared for. The Westcroft succession resolved, not cleanly. Nothing in the real architecture of power ever resolves cleanly, but it resolved. Myron took leadership of the pack with enough internal consensus to make her position viable, and Dalen, through the influence Kale had quietly applied from an angle Seraphine would not have found on her own, accepted a role that preserved his dignity and his utility without giving him the structural leverage to destabilize what came after. It was not the outcome Seraphine had originally designed. It was, she admitted to herself in the private honesty she reserved for her study and the long hours before dawn, possibly a better one. That admission cost her something. And the thing it cost her was the last clean boundary between what she had been for 20 years and what she was perhaps beginning to become, because the system did not collapse. That was the revelation that arrived slowly over the weeks that followed, with the particular weight of a truth that dismantles a fear you did not fully realize you were carrying. The system did not collapse when Kale broke the North Fen agreement. It did not collapse when the Greymoor-Iron Ridge tension spiked. It did not collapse during the Westcroft succession or during the cascade of secondary pressures that those events created. It bent, it strained, it cost her more than anything had cost her in years. But it held, and in holding under conditions she had not engineered, it revealed something about itself that she had never been able to see from inside the controlled stability she had always maintained around it. It was more resilient than she knew, and its resilience came, at least in part, from the relationships she had built within it. Not the managed rivalries, not the controlled tensions, not the carefully balanced obligations, but the genuine trust she had accumulated over 20 years of being, even in her invisibility, someone who was always, actually, working towards something real. The wolves who had relied on her counsel had not relied on it only because she was useful. They had relied on it because beneath the strategic architecture, beneath the manipulation and the management and the invisible influence, there was something they had sensed without being able to name. She had cared, imperfectly, strategically, always filtered through calculation, but underneath all of it, She had genuinely cared whether the kingdom survived, whether the people in it, the ones who never appeared in political accounting, had enough stability to build lives inside of. Kyle had seen that. That was, she understood now, why he had looked for her, rather than simply attacking the system from outside. He had seen, in the pattern of managed stability she had built, not only the corruption she was maintaining, but the care that had built the maintenance in the first place. He had understood, before she fully admitted it to herself, that she was not the enemy of the change he wanted. She was the most qualified person alive to help him build it without burning the kingdom down in the process. The conversation that changed everything between them happened not in a courtyard or a summit hall or through the careful intermediary channels of her network. It happened in her study, in the border territory on a grey morning 6 weeks after the Westcroft succession, when Kale arrived unannounced at her door, not through her network, not through a managed encounter, simply present. Having travelled alone, standing on her threshold in the early light with the specific expression of someone who has made a decision that is not going back. She let him in. She made tea. The ordinariness of it was its own kind of statement. They talked for 4 hours. Not strategically, or not only strategically. They talked about the kingdom, the way two people talk about something they both love and both see clearly and have each, in different ways, been trying to protect from its own worst tendencies. He told her things about his vision for what the pack structure could become if it was built on accountability rather than managed fear. She told him things she had never said aloud to anyone, about the weight of 20 years of invisible labor, about the specific loneliness of being the person who holds the architecture together, while everyone inside it believes the stability is natural. About the nights she had traced the web in the dark and felt the beauty of it and the burden of it in the same breath. He listened to those things the way she had spent 20 years listening to powerful wolves, not waiting for his turn to speak, but actually receiving what she said. She noticed this. She filed it, as she filed everything. But this time the filing felt different, less like intelligence and more like recognition. The visible shift in the kingdom's politics began 3 months later. Not dramatically, nothing Seraphine had a hand in ever moved dramatically, and old habits of craft do not dissolve simply because the philosophy behind them has expanded. But it moved. The North Fen Agreement was rebuilt, as Kyle had promised, on terms that required Saren to dismantle the illegal labor arrangements in his western settlements in exchange for trade conditions that actually made the arrangement economically viable without them. Saren resisted. The resistance was managed, not through the old method of quiet pressure and political maneuvering designed to make him feel the decision was his own, but through a direct formal alliance of 3 packs that made the cost of continued resistance simply higher than the cost of compliance. It was blunter than Seraphine preferred. It was faster than she would have moved. It worked. The Greymore Iron Ridge tension was not managed into continued controlled competition. It was addressed. A formal territorial mediation, the first in the region's history, was convened under neutral auspices. Seraphine designed the process. Kale provided the political weight that made participation non-optional. The mediation took 3 weeks and produced an agreement that both packs found genuinely acceptable rather than strategically imposed. The rivalry did not end. Old territorial rivalries do not end because a document is signed. But the rivalry, for the first time, had a formal channel, a place to go that wasn't escalation. Small things, enormous things. The difference between a peace built on managed tension and a peace built on addressed grievance is not visible in the short term. In the long term, it is the difference between a structure that requires constant invisible maintenance to prevent collapse and a structure that can, gradually, begin to sustain itself. Seraphine was not naive enough to believe the work was finished. She was not naive enough to believe it would ever be finished. The kingdom was not a problem to be solved. It was a living system, endlessly complex, endlessly generating new friction, new misalignment, new points of potential fracture. There would always be wolves who chose their own advantage over collective stability. There would always be successions and rivalries and the specific human and wolf tendency to mistake dominance for leadership. There would always be work, but for the first time in 20 years, she was not doing it alone. And for the first time in 20 years, the work felt less like maintenance and more like construction. She stepped out of the shadows in the way she had always operated, gradually, carefully, by degrees that were invisible until they were undeniable. Not to a throne, not to any formal title or position of rank. She had no interest in those things now, any more than she had ever had, and her reasons had not changed. Formal power is vulnerable power, and she had spent too long understanding the architecture of influence to trade a position of genuine strength for the performance of one. But she became visible in a different sense. Her name began to be said in certain rooms. Her role in certain decisions began to be acknowledged in certain conversations. Not broadly, not publicly, not formally, not in the way that would require her to defend or define or justify what she did through the lens of the dominance hierarchies that still organized the kingdom's official political life, but in the rooms that mattered, by the people who made the decisions that shaped the lives of every wolf in the territory. Her name was said, and it was said with a specific kind of weight that was not quite reverence and not quite fear and not quite respect, but some precise combination of all three that she had never expected to hear applied to herself. She sat with that on a quiet evening in her study, with the border territory dark and familiar around her, and she thought about the 8-year-old girl who had watched adults move through a room and taught herself to read a political landscape that no one had told her existed. She thought about 20 years of invisible labor, of wars that never happened, and successions that resolved, and alliances that held for reasons that most of the wolves inside them would never fully understand. She thought about Kale, standing in her doorway in the grey morning light, having travelled alone, having made a decision that wasn't going back. She thought about the kingdom, all of it, the corruption still inside it, the injustice she had sometimes maintained in service of, stability, the lives she had affected without their knowledge, the ones she had protected and the ones she had not been able to reach, the complexity of it, the weight of it, the fact that she would spend the rest of her life inside it, working, because it was the only thing she had ever found that was equal to the full scope of what she was capable of and what she cared about. The thrones had always belonged to the alphas. That had been true for as long as the kingdom existed, and it would remain true long after she was gone. The formal structures of dominance and challenge and rank, those were not changing, not in any fundamental sense, not in any time frame she could meaningfully affect. But the decisions made before the wars began, the alliances built before the crises arrived, the quiet restructuring of systems so that the wolves at the bottom had slightly more ground to stand on, and the wolves at the top had slightly less ability to extract their security from others. Suffering. The long, invisible, endless work of making a kingdom that deserved the peace it was given, that had never belonged to the thrones, that had never belonged to the alphas. That work, that specific, unglamorous, essential, world-shaping work, had always belonged to the person willing to do it without credit, without title, without the validation of a crown or a rank or a public acknowledgement of what they had built. It had always belonged to someone exactly like her. And she had only just begun. If you made it this far, you already know this story found you for a reason. Drop a comment that says, "I'm with you until the end," because that's exactly what you just proved. If something here stayed with you, the like means more than you think. It's the quiet way of saying this kind of content is worth more of your time, and there's a video right beside this one that continues the conversation. Lighter click, same depth. Go there next. I'll be waiting.